In that context, I'm pleased to start this conversation off with our first topic on water. I'm delighted to introduce Marc Edwards, who's currently the Charles Lunsford Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Virginia Tech. Marc received his bachelor's degree in biophysics from the State University of New York in Buffalo, and his master's and doctoral degrees in environmental engineering from the University of Washington. Along the way, as his degree of master's and doctoral dissertations, he won the national award from the Association of American Water Works Association. In 2004, Time Magazine, it was sort of looking at Mary Lou's presentation where she had the picture of Time Magazine. Time Magazine called Dr. Edwards the plumbing professor and listed him amongst the 4 most important innovators in water around the world. And he has been the recipient of many, many national and international awards, including a presidential faculty fellowship from the White House in 1994 and a MacArthur Fellowship in 2008. Without further ado, Marc.
Well, thank you just so much for having me come here today and talk on this very important issue of sustainable water systems. And in today's presentation, I'm going to unfortunately broaden the concept of sustainability to governance and economics as well as the science. And hopefully in the presentation, you'll see just exactly why that's necessary. The 2 things I really want to emphasize are fixing some of the old mistakes, legacy mistakes that we're still dealing with, as well as trying to get ahead of brand new problems that we're only recently beginning to recognize that affect public health and wealth. So, in terms of old mistakes, it doesn't get any better than lead pipes in Rome. Lead is actually the first environmental contaminant that we realized could kill people and cause neurological damage. And so if you go back to the peer-reviewed literature of 312 BC, Vitruvius, he noted that if you wanted to have a good, wholesome water, you should not be using lead pipe. But unfortunately, the world entered a dark age. That knowledge of Roman times was lost, and if you fast forward to 1928, America, it was possible to find advertisements like this in National Geographic, extolling the virtues of using pure lead pipe. And this was the law in many cities around the country, that if you want to connect your water main to your house, you had to use a lead pipe. And the reason is, lead is a great plumbing material, except it kills people and causes neurological damage. Literally, many of the lead pipes from Roman times are still functioning and far outlast the Roman Empire. And so governments don't historically do a good job fixing problems that they created, and lead pipe is no exception. So there's a book called The Great Lead Water Pipe Disaster, written by Warner Troskin, that outlined how this decision in the US to use lead pipe in this manner caused one of the most serious environmental disasters in US history, and goes through case after case of death, deceit, and denial that have resulted from its use and harm to consumers. So when it comes to this oldest problem, I want to talk about 3 case studies, actually 4, that illustrate the types of problems with water infrastructure that we're facing across the country. The first of these is the problems faced by private well owners, who about 16% of the US population gets their water from a private well system. I then want to go into 2 examples of problems with lead in water of rural America, as well as briefly touch upon the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. So the first of these is private wells. And if you are a private well owner, you know the rules of the game, and that is that you're on your own. You get the water you pay for. You get the water that's coming out of your aquifer and the plumbing system you have. And we have a great research scientist at Virginia Tech who's taken this cause on. Her name is Dr. Kelsey Piper. And no one's really out there even measuring what's happening with private wells in America. But she went out and did so and collected thousands of samples in Virginia and North Carolina and determined the occurrence of lead in water, of the drinking water of people that live in these homes. And what you get is a characteristic distribution there. Of course, a lot of homes have low lead in their plumbing. They have non-corrosive water. But other homes, particularly at the higher end of this distribution, are getting the range that far exceed World Health Organization standards for lead in water. And we compared that to the lead in water during the Flint water crisis disaster, and the two curves are indistinguishable. So in other words, in rural America, they're getting the same water on average in terms of lead content that caused us to call out the National Guard and declare a federal emergency in Flint, Michigan. But all these owners supposedly know that they're on their own and they have to take care of these problems. They should be looking at them, fixing them. But this is a pretty big problem nationally. We've seen clusters of children with elevated blood lead in both very small well systems and just all kinds of very high lead in water and thousands of parts per billion, when the World Health Organization standard is about 10. So shifting gears now, and let's talk about publicly owned water systems, where the vast majority of Americans get their water. And here we really do need to broaden the concept of sustainability, because what you're going to see quickly is the impact of poor and unsustainable government on infrastructure and on public health. And when I say the word poor, I mean both bad government and impoverished government. And taking a step back on this, I was reading some philosophical books recently, and one of the great underrated novels of all time is Rise of the Meritocracy in 1958 by Michael Young. And he's actually the first person to coin the definition for merit equals IQ plus effort and coined the term meritocracy. And it wasn't necessarily in a good way. This was a dystopian novel that said, what is our fate going to be if we just run our government and system as a meritocracy? And one of his warnings was there's a lot of benefits of a meritocracy, but there's also potential dangers. And one of those is that the underclass in a meritocracy is made to feel deserving of their misfortune. And he pointed out that if we wanted to have a good society founded on the basis of meritocracy, there are certain things that probably should not be distributed on this basis, including police protection, education, and health care. And today I'm going to argue that perhaps we want to consider water should also be on that list. So why is that? Well, it turns out, to broaden the concept of meritocracy, American cities are run as meritocracies when it comes to water. And that is that you get the water that your city can afford. You get the infrastructure that your city can afford. And this is not how water systems are run around the world. And it becomes particularly acute problems when you have impoverished cities that are going bankrupt, as the examples I'm about to describe. Now, if you look at other parts of the world, Canada or Germany, there's no such thing as a bankrupt city or a bankrupt water system. The state or federal government will step in to make sure that people get a basic level of water quality, water safety, but not so in America. We don't have any basis, if you have a city that can't afford good water, to have the state or federal government step in to help at this point. And now you're going to see how that plays out in 3 examples. So one example, Texas. You were a proud poster child for in a USA Today article that came out in December, just less than a month ago, and not in a good way, I might add. They talked about this case study in Ranger, Texas, wherein this impoverished city could not afford people to properly run its water system, and how for years and years they skated the state regulatory agencies. They were not following federal law. And so the story went into detail about how families with children were affected by this, children whose blood lead was 20 times higher than CDC levels of concern for lead. And to summarize the story, this is a city that's lost 90% of its population. Once you lose a certain percentage of your population, those who are left behind cannot afford to maintain the infrastructure, much less upgrade it, because they're in a kind of infrastructure death spiral where there's not enough people to pay for clean water. And so you have a town with lead pipes, no corrosion control, not following federal law, you get lead-poisoned children. So that was the thesis of Vitruvius's point 2,000 plus years ago. And you have very seriously impacted children as a result. Now, you're still working on what you're going to do with this problem in Ranger, Texas. I'll go across the country to St. Joseph, Louisiana. This is another city that's impoverished. They've lost 30% of their population. In this case, it's predominantly African American. And if you live in St. Joe on their public water system, this is what the water looks like. And you're being told that the water is safe to drink, even though there's constant boil water alerts. Obviously, you can't wash your clothes in this because it's going to stain your clothes. You can barely flush your toilets with it. And the state, throughout this time, was saying that as bad as it looks, this water is safe to drink. So, unfortunately, this is how environmental injustices are allowed to occur. They occur in blind spots of society. And unless someone gets in there and shines a light on it, those injustices will be perpetuated. And so this is just an example of the drinking water violations that were issued to St. Joseph's. And I don't even know if anyone's there opening the mail. But we have no system to help these folks. So I ask you, is this civilization as we know it, as we expect it? Perhaps not. So an amazing young professor that we work with at LSU, she got involved. She went and sampled in the water there and found out on her own that the lead levels were much higher than EPA allowed, World Health Organization allowed, and realized this was published in April 2016, and there's a lot of shaming process that goes into making the rest of us step up and finally do something about this problem. But if you fast forward to 8 months and around Christmas time this year, the state finally decided that they'd had enough, and they declared an emergency and are going to mobilize some funds to help the city that's been dealing with this water problem for 7 years. 7 years. And I think you're also probably aware or heard about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, 2014, 2015. And like a lot of engineering and science disasters, it starts out innocently enough. You know, you try to do something good and it backfires and people realize it and then they start covering things up rather than being honest and trying to fix it. So in this case, they switched their water source and had this proud ribbon cutting ceremony, and they said, this is a historic day for us. We're putting this new water in the system. And indeed, it was historic, not quite in the way they thought, though, because someone forgot to follow federal corrosion control law. And they not only destroyed the vital infrastructure of their city, but the lead started falling off the pipes into the water supply. This, we now know, occurred with the full knowledge of US EPA Region 5 and the state. We at Virginia Tech mobilized to help Flint from a distance, but I think you've heard the story that there was elevated blood lead in the children of Flint. As the result of this, President Obama eventually declared a federal emergency, and to date illustrates, I think, that when you shine a light on these environmental injustices, people do the right thing. To date, Flint's got $670 million of relief. That's $60,000 per child as the result of what we exposed there. And of course, it became a cause du jour for celebrities. They've got more bottled water than they know what to do with. FEMA was mobilized to test the blood lead of Flint's children. And their infrastructure has been destroyed. So this is what a daily commute looks like in Flint now that their water mains have been eaten up. They're currently experiencing main breaks at a rate 100 times the normal rate of U.S. history. And there's no way Flint residents can afford to fix their infrastructure. It's just not financially possible, given the few number of people that left there. They've lost 60% of their population. So to date, in this disaster, exhibiting bad, malevolent government, there have been 8 civil servant scientists and engineers indicted so far. And if you were following the news around Christmas time, 4 more were added. And so you add all this up, and you talk about infrastructure problems and pipes being out of sight, out of mind, and bad government and economic unsustainability. Let's put an exclamation point on it, and I'll leave that for Comedy Central. Can you play that?
The saddest thing about this leak is how little it would have cost to prevent it all.
The fix was about $100 a day. All of this could have been avoided for just that small amount of money.
$100 a day. Why didn't you say something? I want to call out to all my people in Africa right now watching The Daily Show. Because my friends, for only $100 a day, we can save a village in America and get these people drinking the water that they so badly need for just the price of 5 cups of coffee in New York.
So you have to laugh or else you'd cry, but that's really what it takes to get action in this country. We have to become an international embarrassment and get on Comedy Central. But it turns out lead wasn't the only problem Flint residents were facing, because this combination of bad infrastructure and lack of corrosion control triggered a massive bacteria problem. Harmful bacteria cause Legionella that you're exposed to in the shower. And so we predicted that this would actually trigger a Legionella outbreak, and unfortunately that proved to be true. And once again, the city, state, and federal government knew they had a Legionella outbreak and people were dying at very high levels, and they didn't want to tell anyone because, quote, that would inflame the situation. So 12 people died as the result of this negligence. So what we're really talking about here, is an environmental injustice issue, not only for Flint, but for Ranger, Texas, St. Joe, and all these cities around the country who just can't afford to maintain and produce good quality water. Which brings us, and it's a nice segue, to new problems that we're facing. And that is the problem of opportunistic pathogens, these bacteria that grow in buildings and that we're exposed to in our showers or by skin contact or getting through our eyes and nose that can kill us. This is a new problem that we've just started to realize, with Legionella being at the forefront of that. But there's a whole host of these pathogens, which include Legionella pneumophila, Mycobacteria avium, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and I'll talk about these in just a second. But again, you get these not by drinking the water, but by exposure in your shower. And these bacteria are encouraged and controlled by the plumbing infrastructure. So if you think about the clean water leaving the treatment plant, it doesn't have these bacteria. It goes through the big pipes on the way to your house, but it's really in your house where the water sits around, it gets warmer, that these bacteria can amplify. So we've been studying this very intensively in our lab, and it's only been in the last 8 years that people have accepted this is the major cause of waterborne disease in the United States today, are these bacteria growing in your plumbing. So it turns out this is a shared responsibility, and like many matters of shared responsibility, that means no one's responsible. So the question is, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to control it? And our studies have shown that really the utility plays a key role, that even though the bacteria aren't in the water up to your house, the chemistry determine how fast it grows in your warm and hot water systems of your house. So this is one reason I'm very unpopular with water utilities amongst the others. So It turns out how you heat water is a critical issue. This is like something like 9% of US energy demand is used to heat water. And the way we do it in the US is essentially to have a tank, also known as the Opportunistic Pathogen Incubator. And we have a fight over what temperature to set this. And in the US, because we're litigation avoidance, we've been turning the temperature down. And unfortunately, the optimum that we arrived at to avoid lawsuits is the perfect temperature to grow these bacteria. So we've got to deal with that. And the other thing is that we've got all these issues that affect our vital infrastructure. So we've got changes in our water that occur as a result of warmer temperatures, climate change. We've got pipes getting older, but at the same time, we've got this whole new infrastructure of built environment, sustainable green buildings, which is a whole new ballgame as well. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So the ground is literally shifting beneath our feet in some ways because of efforts to do the right thing and be more sustainable in terms of energy and water conservation. So here's another bad actor, Naegleria fowleri. It's kind of your worst nightmare. It's a brain-eating amoeba with near 100% mortality. Thankfully, there's not many infections of this, but you won't be surprised to know that if there is, when people hear that a brain-eating amoeba with 100% mortality killed people in their town from showering or bathing, it undermines trust in the water supply. So this has become very, very high profile. CDC is tracking this. It's creeping northward, the incidence. We don't know why. Maybe it's because of warmer temperatures. Maybe it's because of what we're doing with our hot water systems or some combination. We're not really sure. But we really have to get on top of this problem because it does create a lot of distrust, even if it's just a handful of deaths as a result. So we're studying this in St. Bernard Parish, New Orleans, again, where you have the bad old infrastructure. That's where these bacteria grow. The other huge issue we're dealing with is the need to be more sustainable, use our sewage-treated water for other purposes. Sometimes we use it for indirect uses, which involves like putting on golf courses or flushing toilets, but increasingly we're considering direct reuse. And we have to have a pipe system to distribute that reclaimed sewage water. And we've done studies on that across the United States where we've gone in and kind of looked at what's happening to those bacteria. And the key takeaway message from this, if you compare potable to recycled water, the red bars there, that's Legionella. Because this water tends to have higher levels of nutrients, it does tend to grow more of these bacteria. So what are we going to do about that? Is it a health concern? We're not sure yet. We've just discovered that these bacteria are there at higher numbers. So we're actively studying that with a lot of different pipe rigs and studying the effects of seasonality. And down here in Texas, if you have recycled water distribution systems, the pipes tend to get quite warm. And again, once you get into that warm range for bacteria, bad things can happen. So we need to get on top of that issue. And then the other issue is green buildings. And this is something I think that's dramatically underestimated. Green buildings are a huge societal investment in infrastructure with good intentions again. We want to save energy. We want to save water. But one of the consequences of that is when you save water or store it in a building, the water sits around for a long time. So the first time we got into this was a platinum certified green building in North Carolina where people would literally not drink the water. It became infamous for having horrible, horrible water. And we went in there and like, what's going on here? And we did some calculation. The water was actually sitting in some of these pipes for 6 months before people drank it. So that's what happens when you save all kinds of water and you don't resize your plumbing. And what we discovered is while it sat around, these opportunistic pathogens were growing and potentially making the water dangerous as well as distasteful. So that's an overview of sort of where we've been, going back to Roman times to cutting-edge research. And we're really looking at this issue. And when I got into the field, I was kind of taught that, the way we deal with these problems is chemical warfare. The only good bacteria is a dead bacteria. And that worked very effectively when we were dealing with sewage fecal pathogens, and we could kill them all at the treatment plant. But it doesn't work at all in terms of growing with these pathogens that are in our home. So we need to think of new approaches, and one of these is a probiotic approach where we have to start thinking about maybe growing good bacteria in our home that can fight off the bad bacteria. Now, for someone like me who was raised in the school of kill all bacteria, it's kind of hard to get on that train, but we're trying to. So just thinking about this, when I got into this field, didn't know where I was going to end up, but I actually started out in the medical field, and I asked an environmental engineer, what is it you guys do? And he actually said, if it weren't for people like me, people like you would be dead. So I thought about that, and I go, that's a really cool career, and so here I am. So thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Hi, Debjyoti Banerjee, Texas A&M. I teach engineering ethics, and we use the WASA case in Washington, D.C. and Flint, Michigan as a case study in our class.
Right. Excellent.
And so, I have followed some of the articles regarding you with great interest over the years. One thing that struck me was, I think in an interview you said the community involvement in Flint, Michigan made the difference, which you did not do in WASA case. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. So we actually had a water crisis in our nation's capital that was 30 times worse than Flint, Michigan. The problem was completely caused and owned by the federal government. And despite 7 congressional investigations and a huge team of Washington Post reporters, the government pulled the wool over the eyes of the entire city and claimed that no one got hurt. And they got away with it for 7 years, and it wasn't through... It's through our investigative kind of reporting, investigative science, that we're able to prove the unethical behavior of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and the U.S. EPA, not only causing this problem, but covering it up. And in the history of scientific misconduct, this is a unique case because this is a problem that was perpetrated by the environmental policemen we pay to protect us, and they became environmental criminals with no profit motive whatsoever. That's why it makes such a great case study. But that was a long, horrible journey for me, starting out very trusting and naive to the point where I finally prevailed and exposed that problem despite the odds. It's sort of what set the stage for our intervention in Flint, Michigan. And I think the difference in Flint, Michigan was I'd learned a thing or two, but also do not mess with people from Flint, Michigan. They're fighters. Leanne Walters is a good example, hero mom. Like this one mom in Flint with twins figured out this whole problem on her own. She figured out everything that was going wrong with Flint, Michigan on her own before she called me. And then we were oddly, the scientists, we were the activists. The science was already done by this amazing mom. So takeaway message, the most powerful scientific force in the universe is a mother protecting their children. Do not mess with that, or else they will come after you and mess you up. We know that from the grizzly bear. It applies to other moms too.
But my question was more directed at, what would your lesson learned be in terms of community involvement?
Oh, okay, community science. Yeah, I could talk about that all day, ethics all day, but if you want to expose environmental injustice, it has to come from the people. A lot of legitimate scientific and political power comes from the bottom up. If you try to impose that top down, you have no chance. If you think you're going to reason with unethical scientists and engineer and hope that they're going to follow logic and data, I am here to tell you you are wrong. Okay, if they got something to hide, they will work. So you have to actually partner with the people. I've been criticized for doing that, but at the end of the day, if we hadn't gotten involved, those kids would still be drinking that water and more people would be dead in Flint, Michigan, and you wouldn't even have heard about Flint, Michigan. That's the scary thing about it.
So I don't mean to hog the time, but can I ask one more question? Sure. Okay. So, sorry.
We can talk. I'll be here for just a few minutes at lunch. Unfortunately, I've got a lot of work to do. And
Yeah, Mark, just a quick question for personal edification. many buildings, many green buildings, are actually going to tankless water heaters for energy reasons. Does that help at all, this
It's
bacteria
amazing.
problem?
They're great. They're the greatest thing ever because the water, you got no storage. You heat the water. The only time it doesn't work is if you have a scaling water where they will clog up just like that because you've got very high, very small pores to heat the water instantly. And so if you have a scaling water, they will clog up, they will drive you crazy, forget it. But if you have a non-scaling water, there's no storage, and they're just better in every way, shape, and form.
Great.
Yep.
Let's thank Mark again.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.